Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Fort, and we are here. We're here for a doozy today. Part 6 of a 9-part series as we journey through What is Poetry by John Hall Wheelock. This is the 6th installment over a chapter called On a Certain Resistance. And if you remember last time in Part 5, at the end of Part 5, I prefaced this chapter by saying perhaps On a Certain Resistance was a chapter about me, as I was starting to have apprehensions about this project. Though it may not have been about me, I think this chapter may have been intended to kill me, because holy shit, do we go a lot of places. But I think we're going to look at the first, we've been looking at the first paragraph, but I think here it is important to extend that to the first 2 paragraphs, which read as such. The distinction between the function of the scientist and the function of the poet has always been difficult to define, and never more so than today, when the concepts arrived at by the inspired suppositions of science and later proved valid by painstaking investigation rival in beauty and imaginative insight the creations of poetry. The difference in the nature of the 2 disciplines or modes of knowledge is so obvious to common sense as to make discussion of it seem absurd. To put this very obvious difference into words, however, is another matter. Is it, Johnny? The poet, you may say, is concerned with the concrete. In the particular, he uncovers the universal. True, yet here his activity parallels that of the scientist, who, from specific events, deduces his general laws. The poet, you may then counter, has always been aware of the things that lie beyond sense perception, and is concerned with them. True again, but in the past 50 years, under the impulse given by Einstein and Rutherford, science has increasingly turned toward phenomena that lie beyond sense perception. He was quoting an article there. Well, you reply, somewhat more confidently now perhaps, how about the early stages of poetic composition? Are not the initial intuition the period of the careful spadework, of testing and rejection, the state of watchful passivity, and the imaginative leap that come when least expected? Are not these the stages of experience peculiar to the poet? No. The scientist grappling with his problem is familiar with all of them. Now we have gone completely off the rails. Look, as much as I love Einstein and I cherish the biographies that I've read of him, the stories about him and his creative process, and I have tried to employ these things in my creative process, to call the poet the grounded of the 2 seems a stretch. I don't know. And then, to make this worse, Wheelock goes on ad nauseum trying to justify these statements by talking about how both scientists and poets are seeking hidden truths to be found in the unity between unlike things. It's insane. I don't know where this chapter came from, but I wish it would go back. Now listen, let's see here. Listen to this paragraph and just try to tell me that this does not reek of Jordan B. Peterson. Just listen. The universe may be conceived as divided into 2 parts. There is the outer, objective universe of so-called reality, the quantitative, measurable, complex, of mass energy in space-time. And there is the equally real inner, subjective universe, the qualitative, undimensional complex of spirit, of feeling, of experience, which is an image of the objective universe as it is reflected in every consciousness. The inner universe is a part of and is contained within the outer structural universe, which, so to speak, overarches and is mirrored in it, as the sky and its stars is mirrored in the lake. But here the analogy ends. Mirrored in consciousness, in the world of spirit, the objective universe is, as by a creative fusion, transfigured. It becomes other than it was. A qualitative dimension is added. What was matter revolving through space and time becomes a star. Beauty and meaning have been added. In a deeper sense, then, the inner universe includes and completes the outer structure within which, paradoxically, it is contained. Making it worse, there's 31 pages of this shit. This chapter is 31 pages basically of that. And so that is an example of a poet taking things so seriously, too seriously, so seriously that there's nothing good to come of it. There is probably an apocryphal story, but a story nonetheless of Robert Frost. Robert Frost was presented with two poets, one of which he would tutor, the other of which he would have nothing to do with. And he asked them, "What do you want to do?" And the first guy said, "I know important things, and I want to tell them." And the second guy said, "I want to have fun with words." And Robert Frost adopted that second poet and took the road less traveled by. Probably an apocryphal story, but that is how you make poetry. You play with words and ideas form from them. You don't set out and say, "You know what? I'm going to do some real Einstein gangster shit today." That's not what you're not going to get there. You're not going to get there. You're going to fail. You're going to write a 31-page chapter full of gobbledygook, such as this. You know what this feels like? This chapter feels, and I'm assuming that most of you watching this aren't going through the book with me, because I don't think this, at 90% positive it's out of print, hard to find. This is the only copy I've ever seen of it. This feels like, so John Hall Wheelock knows what he's talking about, but what this feels like is that you're given that final in a class where you've got an A+, you've got a 96%, but your final is a 15-page paper. But you know your stuff. You're fine. You're gold. You're gold. So you wait until the final week to write your paper. You sit down and you've shot your wad 9 pages in. So you got to beef that son of a bitch up, don't you? You got to make it 15, or at least look like you were fighting towards 15. I mean, 14, yeah, and then you write a little bit, and maybe 13 isn't so bad. But you don't go to the end and make your paper longer. Your paper ends where it ends. So you maybe go 4 or 5 paragraphs back, and you start there. And you just type away. This feels a lot like that. This feels like John Hall Wheelock was given a go-ahead to write a book called What is Poetry, and got a whole lot of essays done that he was pretty proud of. And then he was like, well, without this essay, this book would be a whopping 94-ish pages. Hard to give an impressive go that way. Hard to get the grade you want. you're probably still going to get the A in the class. You're probably still going to get a contract for another book, but whew, you really pulled this one out. So you throw in a 30-page chapter of just word smut, just garbage on a page, and I don't know. There's no excuse for this. There's none. And we get this quote on 63. The psychology of Freud, of Jung, of Rank is, in its basis, a kind of poetry. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of what poetry is. No, it isn't. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of what psychologists are doing. No, it isn't. Creativity in itself does not poetry make. This is such a perversion, 63 pages into a book called What is Poetry, that I don't know where we're going. Unfortunately, we do go somewhere even worse than this. We get this truly bizarre paragraph on page 68, which reads as such: there exists in all of us a deep, instinctive, natural resistance to poetry. This resistance may manifest itself in one of several reactions: indifference, embarrassment, ridicule, or acute aversion. Marianne Moore indicates that she sympathizes with the last of these when she says in her poem entitled Poetry, quote, I, too, dislike it. There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle, end quote. And Nietzsche, himself a poet in the larger sense of the word, registers the same natural resistance in the form of combined ridicule and contempt when he is moved to cry out, the poets, quote, the poets lie too much, end quote. Plato, who declared that poets would be banished altogether from his ideal republic, might, perhaps, have agreed with him. And how many a schoolboy would agree with Plato? How many a grown man or woman has experienced the presence of poetry sensation ranging from a mild embarrassment to an acute distaste? What are you doing, Johnny? Where does this even come from? What are you doing here? You've spent 67 pages talking about the inevitability of poetry, talking about how poetry is waiting to be uncovered with the mysteries of the universe. Now you're saying this? Lay down the wacky weed, fella. I just don't get it. But credit where it's due. Page 73 into 74, we have some examples of just why it is so important to read poetry oh so very, very closely. Again, we might include the single miraculously right word in its divinely appointed place. As propounds Envoi to his poem, Hugh Selwyn Moberly concludes with the lines, when our two dusts with Wallers shall be laid, siftings on siftings in oblivion, till change has broken down all things save beauty alone. It is not difficult to put one's finger on the word that here does the work of 10. Siftings turns the bare statement of the line above into full realization. Santayana, in almost the last poem he wrote, The Poet's Testament, performs a similar miracle. The use of the word furrow in the context of the following lines would mark any writer as a poet. Quote, I give back to the earth what the earth gave. All to the furrow, nothing to the grave. End quote. An example equally outstanding is Yeats' phrase, quote, meager girlhood's putting on burdensome beauty, end quote, where the word burdensome is one stroke, not only brings the whole picture alive and sums up for all time the transition from girlhood to young womanhood, but comments on it as well. That is an example of why reading poetry closely is so important. Want to hear something uncomfortably racist? I knew you did. On page 79, when speaking of going on ad nauseum again of the aversion to poetry, Wheelock gives us this gem of a paragraph. All these are ways of suggesting things without saying them in so many words. Examples of the strategy of the oblique approach whereby the poet surprises us into attention, beguiles us out of our natural apathy, circumvents our active resistance to poetry. As this resistance differs between individual and individual, so it differs between race and race. There has been less resistance to poetry among the Latins than among the Anglo-Saxons, among certain Eastern peoples than among those of the West. The character of this resistance, too, varies from period to period. Every age reveals a resistance peculiar to it, but all of them are fundamentally symptoms of the same thing, different expression of the one deep underlying resistance. What? What? What do you even, where are we going with that, Johnny? What are you doing here? Why even, so A, the observation makes no sense. You've got nothing to stand on. You've got nothing to stand on. Now, no, he tried to brace it, right? He was putting the burden on the white man, right? Like, we're the ones that don't get this poetry stuff so much. Those darker fellas, those fellas to the east, they understand the stuff. We don't. We had to adopt these ideas. But what? So, I think that things like this are always worth a little bit of a conversation, a bit of a pause, because the word racist is so big. Racist does not automatically mean that someone is willing to throw an entire type of people in the grave. That is not what racism is. This is a racism of ignorance. And with a racism of ignorance, what you're doing is basically you're looking and you're seeing, obviously, different races exist. You see that. So a racism of ignorance is to say, I am ignorant to what it means to be a Latins. There must be differences between us beyond skin color and language. And even then, you can learn the different language, right? That is a racist assumption. It doesn't mean that Mr. Wheelock thinks so poorly of people from the East that he wants to get rid of them all. That is not, but this is such a broad term that when someone is hurling an accusation of racism, the accusee feels the weight of a Holocaust versus the weight of, oh, I didn't get that, right? So I think that's one of those things that is often worth at least talking about. And on 80, we get some nice writing advice. Resistance to emotion directly expressed and to the romantic is often circumvented by wit and by devices of tone, irony, indifference, self-mockery, toughness, and so on. Personal themes and lyricism in the first person singular are usually avoided. The language employed is the language of everyday speech, colloquial, even conversational. Resistance to the element of oral delight makes itself felt in the use of dissonance, bare statement, deliberately awkward runovers, deliberately imperfect form, and flawed meter, flat, cadence, false rhymes, etc. The poem is likely to confine itself to accurate, minute observation of particulars without the coordination that would give the whole thing a meaning beyond that of any of its parts. I think that is a good little thing to remember is about subversion. I think a lot of what he's saying there is to be summed up in subversion. You gotta massage the reader into the poem. But that's all I have for this ambiguously racist and certainly too long chapter that was Chapter 6. Make sure you join us next time for Chapter 7, The Process and the Poem, as we go chapter by chapter through John Hall Wheelock's What is Poetry? If you like this sort of thing, make sure you hit the like button. It really helps us out here on the channel. Hit subscribe if you are not already and you made it this far through the video, because what else would you do with your life? Hit the bell notification if you'd like a notification because these are posted sort of irregularly, when the next video in this series pops up. And if you'd like to help us make more content here on Strip Cover Lit, there is, as always, a link to our Patreon to be found in the description below.